All right, so now that we've looked at our histogram, we've got our overall exposure set how we like it, and we've worked on our white balance, it's time to jump into the tone tool section and kind of more fine tune these different settings. Now, if you'll notice here, the sky, it looks pretty good. We do have some clouds. It's a nice blue sky, but one thing I like to do when I'm shooting images like this, like especially like a landscape, really out in the open, and you can see those skies, a lot of times I like to bring highlights down. And you'll notice if we bring it down 100%, it's not doing a whole lot here. We'd have to bring the exposure down some more, but what I want to do is just to pull this back and kind of give us a little bit more depth. So what this is going to do is this is how we start to add contrast into the image. Because if you just go with the regular contrast slider and try to add that, yes, it's going to pull your highlights back and your shadows a little bit, but it doesn't look that great. It's a little bit unbelievable. And we want our image to mimic that of the human eye, because a camera, for example, cannot achieve that look, at least not without some of this post-processing. So before we add any contrast in, the first thing I want to do is pull our highlights back, and I want to do this to about 50% in this particular image. It may be more in others for you. So for example, if you didn't have as nice of a balanced exposure here, you might have to pull this down to -100. But for your image, just kind of eyeball it a little bit. Don't go too far, but add in enough where it is making some subtle changes. And when we do anything to highlights, you always want to also go in and probably tweak the shadows as well. You think of this as like a balancing act. When you do something to one thing, sometimes you need to do the opposite to the other. So there are some areas here that are a little dark, but it's really not that bad. But what I'm going to do is start to pull those shadows up, and I'm not going to go super far. I'm going to go to maybe about 20%, and we can see a quick before and after here. So again, we have our original image on this side and then our edited image on the other side. So let's go back. And now when you do this, when you start to pull up on the shadows and down on the highlights, you're kind of flattening the image. And basically what that means is you're taking some contrast away. And when you do that, to balance everything out, you simply add it back in. Now I'm not going to go too extreme. I'm only going to go to about 10, maybe 15% here. And that's going to add back in some of that contrast between the highlighted and the shadow areas. Now the last two things we're going to look at here are our whites and black. Typically with whites, I'll pull that up just slightly here, maybe to about 15%. And then the blacks, I'm actually going to pull them up on this image to about 10%. And that's just going to kind of neutralize everything, make it look as close to humanly possible as we can. And that's going to give us a really nice balanced image that works really well. And that's really all you got to do with these slider sections, is just kind of eyeball it and play around with it. Just make sure that if you're taking away from one area, you're kind of adding back in other areas, just like we did. Now the present section is what we're going to be talking about next. That's where we're really going to start to see a few more changes within an image, and we're also going to talk about these different sections that I feel like sometimes we can go a little bit too overboard with. So if you're happy with the way your image looks now that we've learned about the tone tool section, let's go ahead and talk about the present section in the next video. And what we're going to be talking about here is the present section of your toolbar areas. So what we have here is texture, clarity, dehaze, vibrance, and saturation. Now these are some tools that I've seen a lot of photographers, especially amateurs and beginners, using a little bit too much of. And you might think that these things are going to aid your image, but in reality, they don't do so great of a job, especially when you add way too much. Now, if you do subtle little additions, that's okay. But here, let's take a look, for example. So in the texture setting, we're just going to start cranking this up, and you can see how this image changes. Yes, this is extremely sharp now, and it actually looks pretty decent for this image. But now let's take it all the way back down. You'll notice the image gets a little bit flat. But when you start to pull it all the way up, this is just way too much. Now, if we zoom in, as far as those little details, that's really nice. So it does make it a lot sharper, and it does do a great job, at least in this landscape setting. So we are going to use it, but let's only go to about 25. And if we go right about here, you can see that it's added more texture to those areas. It has done a great job, but it's not extreme like this. And you can start to see all these little extra details, which I think become really distracting to the image. And that's kind of what makes the difference between a more professional style photo versus an amateur style edited photo. Now with clarity, it works in similar ways, and what it likes to do is to add contrast around sharper areas. So you can see here, clarity at a max 100% is really bad. Clarity at negative is also really bad. So we're going to start back around 0 here and just slowly start to drag this up. I recommend maybe around 10% if you are going to add clarity back in, because again, subtlety is key when you're doing all these edits. Now the dehaze tool here works fine if you're in a situation where your image does look a little hazy, hence the name here. Typically when there's a lot of fog or things like that, you can use the dehaze tool to kind of clear up some of those areas. But unless you have extreme fog in your images, I recommend not even using this tool whatsoever. And even in the case of some foggy images, I probably still would not use this tool. There's other methods we could learn about, but that would be more for my intermediate series. Now, the last two on the section here are the vibrance and saturation. And one thing I see a lot of newcomers do when they're editing photos is go a little wild with the vibrance. And when you do that, it's going to completely change the overall look of the image and just totally destroy your colors. Now, you could pull it all the way down to get more of a black and white look if that's what you're going for, but this is a color image and we want to keep it that way. So if you are going to work with vibrance, I would honestly recommend not going above a +10 if at all, but instead of saturation, what I would do is use vibrance. I feel like vibrance does an overall way better job at fixing up the image, because saturation focuses more on the individual colors and just really drastically pulls those up individually and just, to me, makes a huge mess. But when you do vibrance, it does a better job at balancing out as it's pulling up those colors. So we're going to go to about 30% on this particular image, and you can see that it has done a great job. Now, if you did want to add in just a little bit of saturation, maybe go to about 5% there, and it just adds a little bit more color to the overall image. Not necessarily something I like for the most of my edits, but for the sake of showing you what these two tools can do, especially when you're working with them together, I think this works pretty well. So we're going to actually move this down to about 20, leave our saturation at 5, and I think that looks pretty good. So if you're happy with the overall looks you're getting with your edits after applying some of the stuff we talked about here, you can continue on to the next section, which is going to talk about the tone curve. I think is one of the single most important tools that we're going to be able to utilize when trying to get a better look for our images. Subtle little tweaks in this area and we can do some amazing things.